Do you believe that some people don't die from bullets or hunger, but from the way others look at them? One stare can carve through a soul like a dull knife cutting into pride, the only thing a starving person has left. If that thought tightens your chest, then stay with me. Because tonight, we're going to Dust Creek, where the sun burns everything it touches, and a woman has to sell her body just to buy another day of life. But before we ride further, give me a second if these words already stir something inside you. Hit that like button to keep these Western stories alive. And tell me where you're listening, from maybe a windy porch out in the country, or a quiet little room in town. Because somewhere out there, someone is sitting just like her, Marisol Vega, back pressed to a wall, eyes fixed on the ground, waiting for anyone to stop. Dust Creek. The name sounds like a curse whispered by the wind and sealed with dust. It's a small town, small enough that the slam of a saloon door echoes a half-mile, yet crowded enough for men to come and trade, drink, or disappear. In this place, men come for whiskey, silver, or forgetting. Women exist only for what men can take from them. That morning the wind blew so hard it stripped the road bare. The light wasn't gold, it was white-hot, searing every inch of skin. At the edge of the warped wooden storefronts, beneath a crooked sign that read Trading Post, a half-circle of men had gathered. They weren't talking much. They weren't curious either. They just stood there, waiting for something to happen. At the center sat a woman on the ground. No chair, no shoes, nothing left to cover her but a dress torn to threads. She wasn't crying. She wasn't begging. She just held a short stick with a scrap of cloth tied to it, scrawled in uneven letters. 1 meal = 1 night. A meal for a night. The red dust clung to her face like ash. Her lips were cracked, her throat raw, yet she kept her head bowed. Every time someone walked by, the wind lifted her skirt and showed skin marked with old bruises and new cuts, somewhere behind the crowd. Someone laughed, not with humor, but cruelty. Another one selling her skin for bread. A man said, "Cheaper than whiskey tonight." Another muttered, and both walked away, leaving the dust to sting her face like a slap. Her name was Marisol Vega, though no one there knew it, and maybe no one cared to. To them, she was just another woman, dirty, torn, and beneath notice. 3 days earlier, she'd fled a mining camp in the southern hills, where whiskey and flesh were traded by the same hands. A drunken trader promised her a way out, then sold her for a barrel of liquor. She escaped under a moonless sky, running barefoot through rock until her feet bled. But hunger makes a person small, and Dust Creek was the last place left before dying in a ditch. The sign was her last attempt to stay alive. If she said, "Help me," they'd laugh. If she said, "I'm hungry," they'd wave her off. But 1 meal = 1 night, at least they understood the price. She didn't want to sell herself, but hunger kills slow, and pride fades faster than a heartbeat when the body starts to fail. The wind carried the stench of manure and coal smoke. The porch boards groaned like the tired bones of the town itself, a place too used to watching people fall apart. She sat there, trembling not from fear, but from exhaustion. A child walked past, stared, and was pulled away by his mother. The woman didn't even look at Marisol, but the grip on her child's arm said everything. "Don't look too long, or it'll stain you." She stayed. The sun pressed down, bleaching the color from her hair. Her stomach twisted hard enough to hurt. But worse than hunger was being seen the way men look at an object, not a person. Each passing glance, each chuckle, was another small death. And the cruelest part was that no one stopped not to help, not to hurt, not even to speak. They just walked by, measuring her worth in silence. By late afternoon, the light had turned to copper, and the dust had settled on her shoulders like a thin, unwanted blanket. She no longer knew what she was waiting for. Maybe a coin, maybe bread, maybe a look that wasn't full of contempt. She didn't know that in that exact moment when the red dust curled over those fading letters, a man had stopped a few paces away, looking not at her legs or her chest, but at the sign itself. He didn't smile. He didn't sneer. He simply stood there, silent. And that silence, his stillness, was about to change everything. So, are you still here? Then ride with me a little farther, because this is the moment when Calder Reeves, the quietest man in Dust Creek, took a step toward her and, for reasons even he couldn't explain, decided to stop. Have you ever seen a man step into a crowd without saying a word and somehow make the whole street go quiet? That's how Calder Reeves appeared in Dust Creek that morning. No gunfire, no shouting, just the tall, lean figure of a man on horseback cutting through the sunlight like a shadow drawn in iron dust. Everyone in town knew Calder Reeves, but no one really knew him. They knew he'd once worn a soldier's coat, that he'd left in a winter soaked with blood, and that he came back with a pale scar running across his throat like a thin thread of silver. They knew he lived alone, miles east, where wind and rock outnumbered people, and they knew he didn't meddle in anyone's business. But that morning, when he saw the crowd gathered and their eyes fixed on one spot, he stopped. He hadn't meant to play savior. He just had a habit of noticing what others turned away from, and that scrap of cloth with the words, "One meal equal" sign one night stopped him cold. As Calder walked forward, the laughter died. The men shifted, muttering, unsure whether to mock or make room. He didn't speak. He didn't glance around. The light caught the side of his face, tracing the ridge of that old scar, a quiet reminder that this man had survived things most folks couldn't name. Marisol looked up just enough to see a pair of dusty boots stop in front of her. She didn't dare raise her eyes any higher, afraid to find that same look she'd seen 100 times before, half pity, half hunger. But when he finally spoke, his voice wasn't like the others. No bargain, no command, just low, rough, and quiet, like a man who'd forgotten how to use his voice. "How long have you been here?" She said nothing. Her fingers only tightened on the stick that held her shame. Calder's gaze lingered on the cloth. Slowly, he reached out not for her, but for the sign itself, and slipped it from her hands. The crowd leaned in. She flinched, expecting the worst. But he simply turned the rag over so the words faced the ground and laid it beside the water trough. "You don't need this anymore," he said, voice steady as still water. No one knew why he did it. Maybe not even him. Maybe it was the sight of those raw, split hands gripping the stick like it was the last thing keeping her upright. Maybe it was because he'd seen too many others treated like this before and walked away then. Not this time. From the edge of the porch, a drunk voice cracked the silence. "You buyin' her? Reeves, or we all get a turn." Calder turned his head just enough to meet the man's eyes. No words, no gesture toward his gun, just that look cold and quiet. The laughter died in the man's throat. Then Calder shrugged off his coat, the heavy wool one that kept him alive through cold rides, and placed it around her shoulders. He didn't tug, didn't grab, didn't touch skin, just draped it gently, like setting down a burden. The weight of it startled her. It smelled of horse, smoke, and the road. Marisol clutched it at her collarbone, unsure whether to thank him or run. The question pounded in her head. What does he want? Calder said only 2 words. "Let's go." Not an order, not a request, just said like he expected the world to move with him. She didn't, not right away. That phrase, "let's go," had never led anywhere good before. Every time she'd heard it, it ended behind a locked door. But he didn't turn back or grab her. He just walked toward his horse, tightening the cinch straps like the conversation was over. The men around them stayed silent. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. Finally, Marisol rose. Her legs trembled from hunger and shame. The men who'd jeered earlier looked away now, as if the sight of her standing upright made them uneasy. She pulled the coat tighter and took a step forward, leaving a trail of faint, bloody footprints in the dust. When she reached the horse, Calder was already in the saddle. He didn't look back. "If you mean to leave this place," he said, "now's the time." Marisol glanced over her shoulder. Behind her lay the road south empty, cruel, the same road that had nearly killed her. Ahead, a stranger who hadn't tried to buy her. Two kinds of danger, the one she knew and the one she didn't. She chose the latter, with a shallow breath. She gripped the saddle edge and climbed up behind him. She didn't touch him, just held the back of the seat, knuckles white against the leather. Calder clicked his tongue, and the horse started forward. No one followed. No one spoke. The sign she'd held rolled in the dust until the wind caught it and carried it down the street, words buried face first in dirt. She didn't dare lift her head, only felt the sway of the horse beneath her, the steady rhythm of hooves, the warmth of the coat he'd given her. The smell of leather and smoke mixed with something unfamiliar decency. In her mind, 100 questions swirled. Would he hurt her when they were alone? Was he saving her or just claiming her before someone else did? Calder stayed silent, hands loose on the reins. He didn't turn, didn't reach back, didn't ask anything. The farther they rode, the quieter Dust Creek became, until the only sound left was the creak of saddle leather and the wind moving over the dry earth. When the last roofs of town disappeared behind them. The sunlight softened. The coat around her shoulders grew heavy, almost safe. Gratitude flickered inside her, but so did fear. She didn't know it yet. But that long, silent ride out of Dust Creek was the first time in weeks that someone had touched her without taking something away. And somewhere between one hoofbeat and the next, survival began to take shape again. Have you ever traveled beside someone so quiet, so unreadable, that every small kindness they offered made you wonder what it might cost later? That was how Marisol Vega felt on the road out of Dust Creek, sitting behind Calder Reeves, her fingers gripping the edge of the saddle, her heart pounding with every step of the horse, as if each hoofbeat might decide her fate. The sun had climbed high, the light harsh enough to sting her skin. The trail wound through hills of baked clay and stone, the land painted in rust and bone. Now and then, the wind picked up, throwing red dust over her shoulders like smoke. Calder never turned, never spoke. His back was broad, steady, a wall of silence that felt both safe and terrifying. Every jolt of the horse sent her heart racing. She held on tighter, unsure whether she was hanging on for balance or for life itself. She didn't know where they were going, didn't know who this man really was. And most of all, she didn't know what waited at the end of the road. Every man who had ever offered her help had come with a price. Some asked for it early, others later. Hours passed before Calder slowed the horse near a narrow creek. The sound of running water cut through the still air. He dismounted, tied the reins to a low branch, and said simply, "Drink." His voice was low, rough from disuse. Not kind exactly, but not threatening either. Marisol hesitated, then slid off the horse. Her bare feet burned against the stones. She crouched by the bank, scooping water into her palms. It was cold enough to sting. She sipped slowly, afraid that drinking too fast might offend him somehow. Calder pulled a strip of jerky and a small piece of cornbread from a leather pouch. He held them out to her. "Eat." She stared at the food, then at him, eyes wide, wary, and hollow. "What I do?" After she asked, her voice thin but steady, bracing for the answer she'd learned to expect. He didn't look at her right away. He dropped the pouch to the ground and said, "There is no after. Eat because you're hungry." Then he turned to his horse, letting her decide whether or not to believe him. Marisol bit the edge of the jerky. Her teeth clicked from cold or maybe from fear. She didn't trust free kindness. She'd never seen it before. Every act of mercy she'd known had been a lie, told softly before the pain began. But Calder didn't watch her eat. He didn't lean closer or study her the way men usually did. He just worked the leather straps of his saddle. Calm as if feeding a stray was part of his chores. She studied him between bites. The sunlight fell across his shoulders, outlining the scar that curved along his throat. The wind tugged at his hair. His face was weathered, quiet, the kind that didn't need to raise a voice to be heard. He looked like a man who'd buried more than he'd spoken about. Maybe he had killed. Maybe he had saved. She couldn't tell, and that uncertainty was what frightened her most. "What?" "Your name," she asked softly. Calder Reeves. He didn't turn around. The name itself felt like metal on stone solid. Cold. Immovable. "You don't want—" "Nothing," she pressed. He looked back over his shoulder, eyes steady. "I want you to stay alive." The words hung in the air, strange and impossible. She wanted to believe them, but belief was a thing she'd forgotten how to hold. Back in the mining camp, men used to say, "I'm helping you." Then came the laughter, the bruises, the smell of whiskey. This man gave her food, said nothing, and wanted nothing. And somehow, that was more frightening than cruelty. They rode again. The trail bent through gray hills and scattered rocks. The sun began to fall behind them, turning the sky copper and pink. Marisol could smell the leather, the faint smoke that clung to him. And something else, the scent of someone who'd lived too long alone. Now and then she looked at the leather cord tied around his neck, worn thin from years of rubbing against skin. She wondered if it belonged to someone he'd lost, or someone he still blamed himself for losing. She didn't ask. The silence between them was too heavy to touch. When they crossed a shallow ridge, Calder stopped again and handed her the water pouch. "Far?" she asked. "Not far. Over that hill. Where my place. Just me and the horse." She stared at the road ahead, unsure which was worse, going back to Dust Creek or following this stranger into nowhere. The wind grew colder. She drew his coat tighter around her chest. The shiver that passed through her wasn't from the weather. She feared that, when they reached his home, the kindness would end. She feared that his silence was just another mask for what all men wanted. And yet, deep down, another fear whispered louder that if she ran, she'd never find another place to live through the week. Calder heard her uneven breathing but said nothing. He only reached back once, adjusting the coat around her shoulders before urging the horse forward again. The sky turned dark, the last streaks of sunset glowing like dying coals. Marisol let her forehead rest lightly against his back, not out of trust, but exhaustion. Her pulse beat fast and hollow. For the first time in months, no one was shouting at her. No one was touching her. No one was naming her price. Only the steady rhythm of hooves, the creak of leather, and the strange, quiet mercy of a man who asked for nothing. And sometimes, she thought, silence can be the scariest thing of all. By the time darkness swallowed the hills, Calder Reeves's cabin came into view, a lone flicker of light in a world made of wind and dust. The faint glow from the window looked more like the pulse of a tired heart than a beacon. His horse stopped by the water trough, breath steaming in the cold night air. Marisol sat stiff in the saddle, afraid to move. The cabin stood ahead, small and crooked. The roof slanted from years of weather. It looked too familiar, like all the other places where men had said rest easy, but meant don't fight. She glanced at Calder. He was untying the reins, slow and steady, his face unreadable in the firelight spilling from the door. "Down," he said quietly, then nodded toward the porch. "Go inside. Warmer there." Her feet touched the ground, raw and burning, but she didn't complain. She followed him, each board creaking under her weight like it might give way. He opened the door and stepped aside, letting her go first. Inside, the air smelled of wood smoke and ash. It was a small room, one bed against the far wall, a potbelly stove glowing red, a rough table with 2 chairs, and a single lamp burning low. No woman's touch anywhere, just the order of a man who lived with ghosts and kept them tidy. Calder set his pack on the table, poured water from a jug, and slid it toward her. "Drink." She obeyed, lifting the cup with both hands. The water was cool, clean, no trace of liquor. It tasted like something she hadn't had in weeks. Safety. He stoked the fire, sparks snapping into the air. The orange light warmed his face, showing the lines time had carved into him and the faint pale scar near his throat. "You can eat," he said, still facing the stove. "Then sleep. You don't owe me anything." The word struck her harder than any shout. "You don't owe me anything." Simple, but impossible to believe. She looked at him, waiting for the twist, the price. But there was none. No hungry stare, no appraisal. Just the calm, measured tone of a man saying what he meant. She ate slowly, careful not to spill, the warmth spreading through her chest until her eyes stung. Calder didn't watch her. He added wood to the stove, checked the latch on the window, and hung his coat by the door. When she finished, he nodded toward the bed. "That's yours. I'll take the cot." She frowned. Cuddy pointed to the corner where a narrow folding bed stood. "That one. I sleep there." She hesitated, studying his face, searching for the trap hidden in the offer. But there was none. He just moved on with quiet efficiency, pulling off his boots, setting tools in place, checking the door once more. The bed looked too clean, too soft for someone like her. She sat on its edge, still clutching his coat. The blanket smelled of wood and smoke, something steady and human. It made her chest tighten. Calder moved around the room without fuss, his every motion deliberate and calm. "You don't have to be afraid," he said, not looking at her. His voice carried no promise, no charm, just truth. She didn't answer. Trust was a dangerous thing to handle. It broke too easily. But when she heard him spreading his own blanket on the cot, the sound of fabric and metal legs, something in her eased. He wasn't coming closer. Outside, the wind hissed across the valley. Inside, the fire whispered, soft and low. Marisol lay back on the bed, unsure how to rest anymore. The mattress dipped under her weight. The warmth of the fire reached her feet. She kept the coat wrapped tight and listened for footsteps, for breath, for anything that meant danger. None came. After a long while, the lamp dimmed. Calder sat on the cot, one arm folded behind his head, eyes on the wooden ceiling. He looked like a man too used to being awake when others slept. Marisol turned slightly, her eyes catching the outline of his body in the firelight. He wasn't watching her. He wasn't moving at all. And for the first time in weeks, she exhaled a full breath, quiet and slow. The tightness in her chest loosened. The fear that lived in her bones thinned, like smoke slipping out a chimney. She pulled the blanket up to her chin. The night settled over them like a hush between two strangers who had nothing left to take from each other. Somewhere in the half-silence, she thought, "If this is a trick, it's the kindest one I've ever known." But morning came, and she was still whole. When the first light slid through the cracks in the wall, she woke to the smell of firewood and coffee. Calder sat by the stove, sleeves rolled, not looking back. "Sleep all right?" he asked, voice rough but easy. She nodded. A faint smile touched her lips small. Unsure, but real. And there, in that quiet cabin of a solitary man and a woman, the world had tried to break. Something fragile and new began to grow trust, the rarest mercy of all. Morning in Dust Creek came without bells or chatter, only wind threading through dry grass and the faint sound of a horse snorting near the pen. The light was pale and cold, soft as milk, and it carried that kind of stillness you could almost touch. Marisol Vega woke to something strange, the absence of fear. She opened her eyes to a thin line of sunlight sneaking through the wallboards, the scent of smoke and warm wood, and the quiet rhythm of someone moving beyond the door. Calder Reeves was already awake. He stood by the doorway, pulling on his coat, hammer in hand. When he glanced over and saw her sitting up, he gave a small nod. "Breakfast is on the table," he said, his voice calm, like they'd been sharing mornings for years. There was cornbread and a strip of salted meat. Marisol ate slowly, listening to the steady thud of Calder's hammer outside. Each strike sounded even and sure, echoing across the yard. Somewhere, a chicken clucked, and the fence creaked in rhythm. The sound solid, unhurried, did something to her chest. It made her breathing slow down, made the world feel a little less ready to hurt her. When she finished eating, she wrapped his old coat tighter and stepped outside. Calder paused mid-swing, looked up from the fence, and said, "You can stay inside. It's colder than it looks. I help," she replied. He didn't argue. He just set another hammer beside the bucket of nails. "Watch your fingers." Then, they worked side by side for hours, speaking only when needed. She held the posts. He drove the nails. Every blow of his hammer felt measured, not impatient. The land around them glowed in muted gold, dust rising with every step. Marisol couldn't remember the last time she'd worked beside a man who didn't bark orders. Back in the mining camp, voices had always meant cruelty. "Here." Calder spoke sparingly, his words clipped but not unkind. "That one's leaning," he said once. She shifted her grip, steadying the post. When it stood straight, he gave a short nod. No smile, no praise, but the gesture was enough. It felt like sunlight. By midday, they rested near the trough. Calder poured water into a tin cup and handed it to her before sitting down. "I'll mend the horse stall tomorrow," he said. "If you see anyone ride up from town, go inside and stay there." She looked at him. "Men from Dust Creek. They come here. Maybe," he said. "But if they do, they'll go through me first." He said it evenly, no threat, no bravado, just fact. The kind of tone a man uses when he's done proving himself long ago. Marisol's mind flickered back to the faces from the trading post, the ones who'd laughed at her sign, measured her body like they were pricing a horse. Maybe some of them would talk. Maybe one or two would come looking. But that thought didn't make her tremble. Not with Calder sitting a few feet away, arms steady on his knees, eyes scanning the horizon like nothing could get past him. When afternoon came, they fed the chickens. Marisol carried the grain bucket, scattering handfuls across the yard while Calder checked the corral. The smell of straw, dust, and sun-baked earth mixed into something almost warm, something that felt like life, not survival. She glanced toward him. He stood with the black horse, brushing its neck with slow, sure strokes. "How long you have this one?" she asked. 7 years, he said, rubbing the animal's muzzle. "Knows the way home better than I do." A small laugh escaped her quiet, rusty, like something unused for too long. Calder turned, half smiling. "Haven't heard laughter in this place for a while." She dropped her gaze, embarrassed, but didn't hide her smile. The late sunlight hit her hair, turning it the color of old honey. Calder noticed, then looked away quickly, pretending to check the fence. By the time the sun dipped behind the ridge, the day's work was done. They carried wood back inside, moving without instruction, each knowing what came next. She stacked kindling near the stove while he poured water into a pot. No words, just rhythm. When the fire caught, Calder sat near the door, whittling a block of wood. Marisol mended a tear in her blouse, her needle moving slow and steady. The cabin filled with small sounds, the scrape of his knife, the pop of firewood, the sigh of wind against the walls. Ordinary sounds, peaceful ones. After a while, he spoke not loud, but clear. If anyone from town comes here, you don't need to be afraid. I've got eyes farther than they think. She looked up, meeting his gaze across the lamplight. His face was calm, his tone certain. I believe you, she said softly, and realized it was the first honest thing she'd said in weeks. That night, they ate by the fire, simple food, but enough. She handed him water, and he passed her bread. No thanks were spoken, yet every motion carried quiet respect. Later, when she lay in bed, Calder stayed near the door, watching the darkness outside. The wind pushed at the shutters, but nothing else moved. Marisol closed her eyes and listened to his footsteps pacing slow, steady, each one a promise that if danger came, he'd be the one to meet it first. In the glow of the fire, the fear that once lived in her chest began to fade. It wasn't kindness that made her feel safe. It was the steady silence of a man who kept his word without needing to say it. The days that followed passed in a kind of quiet that didn't hurt anymore. It was no longer the silence of suspicion, but of understanding, two people learning, in their own ways, how to live again. The mornings started the same. Calder was always first to rise. The sound of the barn door creaking open, steady as a heartbeat. Marisol woke to the smell of smoke and coffee, to the soft shuffle of boots on wooden floors. She was still learning not to flinch when she heard a man's footsteps. Still learning that sound could mean safety. They worked side by side through the cold hours, saying little. Calder mended fence rails and cleared brush. Marisol fetched nails, fed chickens, stacked wood. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was a kind of truce, made between two people who knew how much words could wound. Every now and then, their eyes met over the yard, and for a brief second, it felt as though they could see straight into the broken parts of one another, and didn't turn away. Around noon, Calder sat under the porch, whittling a small piece of pine into the shape of a bird. Marisol washed clothes by the water trough, sleeves rolled to her elbows, the scent of soap mixing with sunlight. She looked up once and noticed the pale scar that ran from his jaw down across his throat, a mark too straight to be an accident. "You were a soldier?" she asked softly, almost afraid to disturb the calm. Calder paused, knife still in his hand. "Yeah, long time ago." "You were hurt? In a battle?" "Not exactly," he said after a moment. "Someone I trusted made a bad call. I made a worse one by staying quiet." There was no anger in his tone, just the flat truth of a wound that never quite closed. Marisol didn't press. She turned back to her washing, the water rippling around her wrists. After a while, it was Calder who asked, "What about you? How'd you end up alone out here?" She stopped scrubbing, the fabric dripping between her fingers. "My people wanted me to marry an old man. I said no. So they said I had no home anymore." Calder set his knife down. The wind shifted between them. "How long have you been on your own? I don't remember," she said. "Every day felt the same. Sometimes I thought I'd died somewhere along the road, but every morning I still woke up. So I guess I hadn't." She smiled faintly at her own words, and for the first time, he saw something warm flicker behind her weariness. He reached for the small wooden bird and tossed it gently her way. "Here, keep it." She caught it, confused. "Why?" Because it reminds me of you, he said. Small, but nobody catches it if it doesn't want to be caught. Her laugh came quiet and unsteady, like wind through tall grass. From then on, something shifted between them. Not friendship. Not quite yet, but a mutual recognition. They had both survived what should have ended them. Later that afternoon, the sun fell low across the fence line. Marisol hauled buckets of water for the horse, watching her reflection tremble on the surface. She barely recognized herself anymore. The fear in her eyes was thinning, replaced by something quieter strength. Maybe. Calder was nearby, cleaning the saddle. You had a family, she asked, careful not to sound like pity. He stopped for a long time before answering. I did. She waited. My wife and boy died 3 winters back. Fever took them both before I could get help. He said it plainly, the way men do when grief has lived in their bones too long to need ceremony. Marisol didn't say, I'm sorry. She just sat beside him, her hand brushing the edge of the wooden rail he leaned on. You've been alone since then. He nodded once. Thought I'd gotten used to it. Then I saw you in Dust Creek. She turned toward him. His voice wasn't tender. It was steady, honest, and somehow that steadiness meant more than comfort. The wind stirred again, carrying a strand of her hair across her face. Calder lifted a hand to move it, but stopped halfway, his fingers curling back. He didn't touch her, and yet the kindness of that restraint reached her more deeply than if he had. They sat that way for a long time, 2 souls who had nothing left to prove. Just the quiet knowing that someone else understood without needing to ask. When evening came, they went inside. Marisol fed the fire. Calder stacked wood beside it. The yellow glow filled the cabin, lighting 2 faces that had both known too much loss, and yet, under that same roof, something in them softened. Marisol set the carved bird on the table. It'll stay here, she said, until we decide where to fly next. Calder looked at it, then at her. Let it stay, he murmured. Sometimes staying put is its own kind of flight, outside. The wind sighed over the plains, inside. The firelight flickered against the walls, turning the cabin into a small island of peace in a vast and lonely land. Neither of them spoke the word love. Neither of them made promises. But when Marisol lay down that night, she realized it wasn't just calm she felt anymore. It was the rare, quiet grace of being seen, understood, and respected by someone who had also been broken and chose, like her, to live anyway. That afternoon, the wind over the valley quieted. The light turned soft and amber across the new fence line, and the usual noises, the hammering, the cluck of hens, the steady rhythm of work faded into stillness. Marisol Vega stood under the porch, her hands clutching the edge of Calder Reeves's old coat, watching him gather his tools into a wooden crate. The question she'd been carrying all morning burned low in her chest, waiting for a moment when the silence between them felt safe enough to break. Calder, she said quietly. He turned, squinting against the light. Yeah, her throat tightened. If people come here, and they ask who I am, what would you tell them? He didn't answer right away. The air stretched thin between them, not heavy, not tense, just full of something that mattered. Calder set the hammer down and leaned forward on his knees, meeting her eyes. His voice, when it came, was steady and low. If calling you my wife keeps this house peaceful, he said, then I'll say it. But only if it's what you want. The words landed softly, yet they struck deep. Marisol blinked once, twice. She'd heard many men speak of keeping peace, but in their mouths. It always meant control. In his, it sounded like protection. Only if I want, she repeated. He nodded. No one in town gets to name you but you. Not anymore. The wind stirred the dry grass, carrying a faint scent of earth and smoke. Marisol lowered her head, a few strands of hair falling over her face to hide the moisture in her eyes. She'd been property before. A bargain struck in whispers and liquor. Now, for the first time, someone had left the choice in her hands. She lifted her head, voice barely above the wind. "If you call me wife, they'll believe you." "They will," he said. "And they'll stop asking. They'll stop looking at you the way I hate seeing them look." She smiled, small and uncertain, but real. "Then, if that day comes, you can say it." Calder studied her for a moment longer, his eyes warm in the fading light. "You're sure?" She nodded. "If they ask, I'm the one who stayed." He didn't answer. He just held out his hand, not to pull, not to claim, but to let her see the gesture for what it was, a promise without words. She looked at his hand, rough and scarred, and placed hers in it, lightly, but without hesitation. That night, dinner was quieter than usual, but not the kind of quiet born of distance. It was the calm of understanding. She ladled stew into his bowl. He passed her water. Each movement carried a rhythm of trust, simple, human, steady. Afterward, Calder went to check the horse, while Marisol cleared the table. When he came back, the moon had risen pale above the hills. She sat near the fire, mending a loose thread on her blouse, her face half lit in the flicker. He watched from the doorway, saying nothing, yet feeling something unfamiliar, the comfort of belonging to a silence that didn't hurt. She looked up. Their eyes met, and for the first time, she didn't look away. "Have you ever thought about calling me that for real?" she asked softly. Calder stepped inside, the fire painting his face in gold and shadow. "If I ever said it," he told her, "I wouldn't take it back. I don't say things I don't mean. And if I wanted it to be true, then I'd listen," he said. His tone was low but certain, because what I'm holding on to isn't a word. It's the person standing right here. Her smile grew then gentle, unguarded, the kind that made a man feel the years of loneliness finally begin to fade. As she stirred the fire, he spoke behind her. "As long as you're here, this house will stay quiet." She turned, the firelight soft against her face. "And as long as you're here, I won't be afraid." Two simple sentences, yet they laid the kind of foundation stronger than nails or wood. Later, they sat on the porch together, watching the sky fill with pale stars. The night was cool and still, the world wide enough to hold every unspoken thought. Marisol leaned against the porch post. Calder sat beside her, close enough to feel her warmth, far enough to respect it. "Do you think," she began softly, "one day people might believe someone like me deserves to be called a wife?" Calder looked toward the horizon. "I don't need them to believe it. Only you." Her voice lowered. "Then maybe I will. Not today, but soon." He didn't smile. Not fully, but the light in his eyes changed, soft and alive. It was the look of a man who'd once lost everything and had just found a reason not to keep losing. When they went back inside, Marisol paused at the table where the little carved bird still sat. She touched it lightly and whispered, almost to herself, "If anyone asks, I won't hide anymore." Calder heard her. He didn't answer. He just laid a gentle hand on her shoulder and left it there. The lamp flickered. The fire hummed low. Two shadows leaned toward one another on the cabin wall, one that had forgotten how to trust, and one that had finally learned how to protect without taking. And in that quiet, simple room, with no vows spoken and no witnesses at all, something rare and steady bloomed, a kind of happiness built not from promise or passion, but from the deep peace of trust, finally returned. Dawn rose after a windless night. The first light slipped through the cracks in the cabin wall, falling across the rough wooden table where the little carved bird still rested its wings folded, as if asleep. The fire had died down, leaving only a trace of warmth in the air. Marisol Vega woke not from fear or noise, but from the gentle touch of sunlight against her eyes. She sat up slowly, feeling the coarse wool blanket and the quiet rhythm of a man's breath moving somewhere beyond the door. Calder Reeves was out by the trough, giving water to the horse. The light caught his shoulders, shaping him into a figure both solid and calm, a man who had once carried too much sorrow, and finally learned how to let it rest. Marisol watched him from the doorway. There was no loneliness in his stillness now, only peace, and she realized somewhere in that peace she had found her own salvation. They were no longer strangers. Days spent under the same roof had worn away all the edges of fear. She swept the floor, mended his sleeves, cooked their meals not out of duty, but because she wanted to preserve the quiet rhythm they'd built. Calder worked the fences, tended the horses, chopped wood not because he had to, but because he knew someone inside would need the warmth come nightfall. That afternoon, Calder came in from the field carrying a handful of hay and a sprig of rosemary rare in Dust Creek. He set it on the table and said simply, "For the stove. Smells better this way." Marisol looked at the herb, then at him. It wasn't a gift. It was thoughtfulness, plain and steady. She smiled, and for the first time, her smile held no shadow of fear. As they ate together, she asked, "If I left, would you come looking?" Calder put his spoon down. "No," he said quietly. "If you go, it's because you know where you're meant to be. But if someone forces you to leave, I'll follow every trail until I find you." Her throat tightened. He wasn't claiming her. He was offering something far greater, the freedom to choose. And in that freedom, she discovered she didn't want to go anywhere at all. That evening, the wind returned, carrying dust across the fading fields. The sky turned the color of honey and rust. Marisol stepped out onto the porch, holding the small wooden bird in her hand. The air smelled of grass and sunburned earth. It felt like the world itself was closing one chapter and opening another. Calder came to stand beside her. He didn't ask what she was thinking. He didn't need to. "Calder," she said softly, "I'm staying. Not because I owe you anything, but because I choose to." He turned toward her. The last of the light caught the gray-blue in his eyes. He said nothing, just moved closer. The space between them, once wide with silence and fear, was now small enough for breath to bridge. She smiled faintly. "If anyone asks, you can call me your wife, but not to keep peace anymore, because I want this to be my home." Calder nodded once and lifted his hand to her cheek, the first touch he'd ever allowed himself. It wasn't urgent or possessive. It was reverent, almost shy. The touch of a man who knew what it cost to be gentle. Marisol tilted her head into his palm and let herself belong. Just this once. Then he kissed her slowly, quietly, with the kind of tenderness that belongs only to people who have already lost too much. It wasn't a beginning. It was a release, a farewell to the ghosts that had followed them both. They stayed like that for a long time, the wind moving around them, the land stretching wide and golden. Dust Creek no longer felt cruel. It felt like a place that had finally forgiven them. That night, the lamp cast two shadows across the cabin wall. Calder sat at the table sharpening his knife. Marisol stitched a small cloth beside him. No vows, no words of promise, just the rhythm of two lives finding their way into harmony. Before bed, she placed the cloth beside the little wooden bird and whispered, "Now it has a pair." Calder looked up and smiled gently. "And it'll fly when you're ready. Later." She lay in his arms, her head against his chest, listening to the slow, steady beat of his heart like the swing of his hammer every morning. Outside, the wind brushed the dry grass, soft as a lullaby. In that cabin between wind and dust, two souls who had lost everything found each other again, not because fate demanded it, but because they chose it. They chose to stay, to trust, to begin again, even after the world had given them every reason not to. And you, the one hearing their story, if you've ever carried loss in your chest, if you've ever wondered whether life still has a place for peace, remember this: the truest strength isn't in love itself, but in the choice to remain when no one asks you to. For Calder and Marisol, that choice became their rebirth. Tomorrow they may argue about the hens or the firewood, but come nightfall, that same lamp will still glow in the window, a small, steady light born from two hearts that learned the same lesson. Even after everything, we can still choose love, still choose home, still choose to live,